Good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know, I'm Jerry Halpin with the Historic Society, and I want to welcome you to our final Cotuit Chronicles lecture for the 2024 season. As you know, the Historical Society is a nonprofit organization that is financed by memberships, donations, fundraisers, and our gift shop. So I encourage all of you that are not members of the Historic Society to please join. There's applications in the back. Any donations you want to make tonight will go towards our phase 2 of our capital campaign, which is to remove the modern features out of the Dockridge homestead. And I use modern in a very loose term. For the Dockridge homestead, it's modern. For us, it's not modern. Those of you who haven't had a chance to stop by our phase 1, which is our new museum, please do. It's beautiful. It has great exhibits and great signage and everything. And I think it's really wonderful, and you should stop by. Tonight's presentation will be recorded and posted on our website, so please let your friends and neighbors know that weren't able to make it tonight, that they can watch it there. And if you missed any during the summer, they're up on our website now. Tonight I have the pleasure to welcome Greg Williams, who will be speaking about the Sacco and Vanzetti trial and a little bit about that connection to Cotuit, which there are a couple. Greg was a Massachusetts District Court judge for 15 years, retiring in 2015. For the last 10 years, he was the first justice of the Edgartown District Court and the presiding justice of the Appellate Division, Southern Division. Before taking the bench, he was an assistant attorney general, lastly serving as deputy chief of the Western Massachusetts Division. Before that, he was in private practice for about 15 years. He's a dual U.S.-Canadian citizen and holds degrees from Western Maryland College, now McDonald College, Queen Mary College, University of London, and Washington Lee University School of Law. He talks on topics of Massachusetts historical crimes, notably Cape Cod figures and the Romantico Macabre. He served on the boards of several Cape nonprofits and is the immediate past president of the Board of Trustees of the Sturgis Library. His website, GregoryWilliamsSpeaks.com, and his Facebook page, Gregory Williams Speaks, continue to signal his scheduled events and offers peeks into the odds bits of history, art, and music. So please welcome Greg.
Thank you. Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That's all we have time for tonight. No, thanks, Jerry. I'd like to thank everybody who came here tonight. I know, or at least I'm assuming, that the presence of many of you was compelled by your membership in the Historical Society of Santuit and Cotuit, but there are a couple of people here I know who ventured forth here tonight voluntarily, so I appreciate everyone's being here. And I want to thank the Historical Society for asking me to present this program to you tonight, and especially to Jerry Halpin for contacting me and signing a check, I hope. So let me start with a quote, and that quote is, "Now there came multitudes of men of the lowest class from the south of Italy, ranks where there was neither skill, nor energy, nor any initiative of quick intelligence. And they came in numbers which increased from year to year, as if the countries of the south of Europe were disburdening themselves of the more sordid and hapless elements of their population." That is a quote from a book called A History of the American People by not yet President Woodrow Wilson, 1902. In 1908, 129,000 immigrants from Italy came to this country. Two of them were 17-year-old Nicola Sacco and 20-year-old Bartolomeo Vanzetti. They did not know each other. Sacco was from a small village called Torre Maggiore in Puglia, and Vanzetti was from Villa Filetto in the northern Piedmont, some 540 miles away. Both of them were from stable families. They did not come to the United States out of any kind of economic desperation or any kind of revolutionary fervor, but to secure their own independence, and in Vanzetti's case, to escape his own grief over his mother's death. Now, luckily, immigration has not been an issue in this country for decades. You just don't hear about it anymore. But nativist prejudice in the United States against Italians and others had run deep since the first wave of Italians in the 1880s. They were generally considered by many of the nativist population as being criminals, anarchists, or worse. Plus, they were Catholic, they talked funny, they ate weird food that has never become popular here in this country. Now, it's true that among those immigrants there were adherents to anarchism. The concept of anarchism can seem frustratingly amorphous. Most people just think of it as abolishing government altogether, abolishing law, abolishing private property, and it is kind of that. And the anarchist belief was that if all those institutions had been swept away, people will become free, because people's instincts toward cooperating with each other will replace instincts of destructive competition. So anarchism at that time was kind of an impractical faith in the goodness of the oppressed worker. And it was born of the perception that unbridled industry, unbridled capitalism had divided Western civilizations, societies into the very rich and the poor. Luckily, again, this topic of income disparity has been relegated to dusty history. But in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, anarchism both fueled and was fueled by frequent violent clashes between labor and management, such as the Haymarket Affair in Chicago in 1886 and the Bread and Roses textile strike in Lawrence in 1916. I beg your pardon, 1912. Many anarchists did not advocate violent change, but some did. You can probably guess that because this is a mugshot. This very prominent proponent of what was called propaganda by the deed, which means violence, Luigi Galliani, lived for a while in Rentham, here in Massachusetts. His published works included a periodical called Chronica Sovversiva, which means Chronicle of Subversion. And he also had a booklet, 46-page booklet called Health is in You, which was a bomb-making manual. Among Galliani's followers were Sacco and Vanzetti. In 1917, when Sacco and Vanzetti met each other for the first time, it was their membership among a group who traveled to Mexico to avoid the draft into the U.S. Army for World War I. The United States got into the war in 1917. It had been raging in Europe since 1914. But they wanted to avoid the draft. They also wanted to be ready to leave for Italy once the global revolution that Lenin had promised in Russia spread there to Italy. That didn't happen. Eventually, the group of anarchists who moved to Mexico dispersed. Sacco and Vanzetti both came back to Massachusetts. Sacco ended up being an expert shoe edge trimmer. The shoe industry was huge in Massachusetts, as you probably know. And by 1920, the Sacco family lived in Stoughton. That is Sacco, his wife Rosina, and his son Dante. By 1920, Vanzetti was living in North Plymouth, and he was a fish peddler there. On April 15, 1920, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, on Pearl Street in South Braintree, two men were walking the few hundred yards from one building of the Slater Morrill Shoe Company to another of its buildings. They were 45-year-old assistant paymaster Frederick Parmenter, who was a 20-year employee of Slater and Morrill, and 44-year-old security guard Alessandro Birardelli. He had begun work only that previous fall. They were each married. They each had 2 young children. The steel boxes they carried from one of Slater's buildings to the other contained cash pay packets that totaled, depending on your source, about $15,700 or so. Historical present-day value money conversions are very difficult. Let's call it $300,000, something like that. Beg your pardon, $200,000. They might not have been armed. If anyone was armed, it would have been Birardelli. He was the armed guard. But it's unclear whether or not he was. We'll get to that. The story of what happened next, as nearly every dramatic event presents these kinds of factual issues, can vary quite a bit depending on what witnesses to this event you want to choose. This is Pearl Street, looking down the direction that Parmenter and Birardelli would have been walking. And that building on the right is another shoe company called Rice and Hutchins. And so the two, Parmenter and Birardelli, walked down this street, and in front of that building there were 2 men lounging on one of those iron pipe fences. And just as they reached these 2 loitering men, that is Birardelli and Parmenter, one of them pulled a pistol and shot both of them. Parmenter tried to run across the road. There were some laborers digging a foundation across the road for a restaurant. He was shot twice. Birardelli fell immediately. The gunman stood over Birardelli's crouched body and pumped 3 more bullets into him. And then, having been signaled, a large car. Oh, I think there's one more picture of the street. Yeah, this is it. This is Rice and Hitchens, and there's the fence right there. We're talking about an industrial area here, but as you see, it's a dirt road. So the 2 men are shot. The cash boxes are picked up. A large car with 3 men in it drove up. The cash boxes were thrown into the large car, and the 2 bandits jumped into the car, and the car tore away, to the extent cars in 1920 could tear away. This whole episode was over in less than 1 minute. Birardelli died immediately. One of the bullets had severed his aorta. Parmenter lived long enough to mumble something unintelligible to the investigating police officers, but he expired the following morning. The police in New Bedford and police in Providence, when they heard about this incident, knew immediately who it was, or at least suspected who it was. They assumed that the perpetrators of this very violent robbery was the Morelli gang of Providence, Rhode Island. They were a gang that specialized in targeting shoe manufacturers. Sometimes they actually stole shoes. Sometimes they stole money. Several gang members had in fact been indicted for thefts from Slater and Moore, the same place. It was obvious to those law enforcement agencies who had done this. But much of the law enforcement community was focused on, if not obsessed with, foreign radicals. I don't know if you can read this. Caption, "Come unto me, ye oppressed," and there's a European anarchist with a dagger and a bomb. Bolsheviks, anarchists. Extreme jingoism had flourished in the United States since it had finally entered World War I in 1917. And the press, of course, churned up that hysteria. Not that there was no basis for concern. 1 year before these Braintree murders, in April April 1919, authorities had uncovered a plot to mail 36 bombs to various pillars of American government and industry. 8 of those bombs exploded in 8 cities. Only one person was injured. She was a maid to a senator in Georgia. She had her hands blown off. And a month later after that, in May of 1919, a huge bomb ripped the front off the Washington, D.C. house of the Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer. The Palmers, miraculously, were uninjured, but they were soon wandering sort of dazedly out in their front of the house, smoking rubble all over the place, and there were scattered pink leaflets all over the ground from the anarchist fighters. Palmer then soon launched what became known as the Palmer Raids. This was the first Red Scare in the U.S. Small armies of federal agents, augmented by local law enforcement, would storm communist, anarchist, Russian groups, and sometimes they even bothered to obtain warrants. They arrested literally thousands of people, but there was very little evidence of any kind of national conspiracy or widespread conspiracy. But the radicals were terrified. The following month, February 1920, the Department of Justice, acting on a tip regarding those anarchist flyers, sequestered 2 men in their New York offices. They kept them there for months. Some Boston area anarchists, including the group that Sacco and Vanzetti was affiliated with, wanted to learn the status of these 2 prisoners, really, in New York. And Vanzetti was chosen to go to New York and see if he could find out something about their status. He didn't learn a lot. He learned only that the heat was on radicals. Came back, and a few days after he got back, he said, anarchist literature that we have must be gotten rid of. And so that endeavor sort of started. And a few days later, the broken body of one of those 2 detainees in that New York high-rise, a gentleman named Salcido, was found on the sidewalk, 14 floors below. The press reported that he had told the Department of Justice that Galliani, Luigi Galliani, was behind all these bombings. More heat on the followers of Galliani here in Massachusetts. The group needed a car to collect this incriminating evidence. And on May 5th of that year, 4 anarchists gathered at Sacco's house in Stoughton. The 4 were Sacco, who was then 29 years old, Vanzetti, who was 31, a gentleman named Riccardo Orsiani, and another man called Mario Buda, who was known sometimes as Mike Boda. Boda owned a somewhat battered car.
Did you want to go back to him?
Yeah, back to Boda. He owned a car called an Overland. He planned to retrieve that car to use it in collecting this literature. It was in a West Bridgewater garage. Sacco and Vanzetti rode a streetcar over there. The police chief in Bridgewater was Michael Stewart. He was actually pretty much the whole department, the whole police department there in Bridgewater. And he was rabidly obsessed with anarchists. Don't know how many anarchists there were in Bridgewater, but he was obsessed with them wherever they were. A few months earlier, on Christmas Eve in 1919, in Bridgewater, 3 men tried to rob a truck carrying more than $33,000 in payroll money. It was another shoe company. So one of them fired a shotgun, didn't hit anybody. The truck crashed, the whole plan came apart. The robbers took off in their car without scoring any kind of money at all. Stewart was convinced that the perpetrators of that crime was a gang of Reds and Bolsheviks. Now, back to April 16th, the day after the Braintree crime that I just described at the Slater and Morrill factory, the federal authorities had asked Stewart this rabid anarchist hunter, to help them in deporting the anarchist named Cotuit. Cotuit lived with Buddha. Police found Cotuit, and given some suspicious circumstances, Stewart decided that Cotuit was one of the Christmas Eve bandits, a failed attempt to rob that truck. And further, and this is kind of critical, he thought Buddha's car, that Overland, had been involved in transporting the bandits to and from that scene. Very little evidence for any of this, as you can see. Buddha's car, the Overland, was in the garage of a guy named Simon Johnson. Stewart had asked Johnson to call him if anybody came for the car. So on the night of May 15th, Sacco, Vanzetti, Orsiani, and Buddha show up at Johnson's place to retrieve the car. Johnson's wife called Chief Stewart. Johnson advised Buddha not to take the car. It lacked proper license plates. So Buddha said he would send somebody for it the next day. Buddha and Orsiani got on their motorcycle, drove away, and Sacco and Vanzetti got on a streetcar like this one, which is kind of cute, to take it to Brockton. So when Stewart got to Johnson's, everybody was gone. He alerted Brockton police about the two men who were on the streetcar, Sacco and Vanzetti. And just before 10 o'clock that night, the streetcar stopped on Main Street in Brockton. And police officer Michael Connolly and Earl Vaughn boarded the streetcar looking for two foreigners who had tried to steal or take a car in Bridgewater. Right away. Stealing, it was Buddha's car. And the car didn't go anywhere. Nobody touched it. And taking a car must be different from stealing. What does that mean? Who knows? Really thin. So the two officers get onto the streetcar. Connolly sees Sacco and Vanzetti. Vanzetti would later claim that Connolly pointed a revolver at him and said, "Keep your hands out on your," no, I beg your pardon, don't move, you dirty thing. Connolly also might have said, "Keep your hands out on your laps or you will be sorry." In any event, he told them, Sacco and Vanzetti, that they were under arrest. And they asked, why? What for? And he said, suspicious characters. So the police have nothing at this point. They've got nothing, no ground for arrest. And under the law that exists now, and has for decades, police had no reason to seize Sacco and Vanzetti. To effect a seizure now, police now must have reasonable suspicion based on specific and articulable, which is a hard word to say, facts. And that has to show that a person that they are stopping is committing a crime, has committed a crime, or is about to commit a crime. Where is it here? There's nothing. Today, motion to suppress for the stop allowed. Case is over, and this talk just ended. Matters were a little looser in 1920. The police searched them, Sacco and Vanzetti. And on Vanzetti, they found a .38 caliber Harrington and Richardson revolver and 4 shotgun shells. Apparently, Sacco was also searched at the scene, but not very well. When they got to the station, police found on Sacco a .32 caliber Colt automatic with 9 rounds in it, plus 23 cartridges of varying kinds. Apparently, it was not unusual for Italians in southeast Massachusetts at the time to be armed. But Connolly would claim at trial a year later, for the first time, that on the streetcar, both Sacco and Vanzetti had made moves as though they were about to draw their firearms. A year later. In fact, Connolly would testify that Sacco, in the car, the police car, twice tried to put his hand under his overcoat. So police were so worried about these two desperados who had supposedly brazenly killed two men in broad daylight without hesitation that even after they thought Sacco was trying to pull a gun out of his coat, they didn't bother to search him thoroughly until they got him to the police station. Again, Connolly never testified or told anybody before trial that these two men had made a threatening movement. And the other police officer, Vaughn, never claimed that either of them had done any of those things. So now they're in custody. Sacco and Vanzetti were not asked regarding the Bridgewater crime by the police. They were not asked about the Braintree crime. They were asked, why were you in Bridgewater? How long have you two known each other? And most pointedly, are you radicals? Are you anarchists? Are you socialists? Are you communists? Do you believe in the government of the United States of America? It seems reasonable that given those questions that Sacco and Vanzetti believed they were being investigated for anarchist activities. It was the very reason they were out there that night. They didn't want to be prosecuted for anarchist activities. They didn't want to be deported, and they didn't want to fly out of anybody's 14th story window. So they lied. They lied to the police, and they lied to the district attorney, a gentleman named Fred Katzman, when he showed up. They lied about almost everything they were asked. They weren't at Johnson's. They didn't know Buddha. They weren't anarchists or communists or socialists or anything else terrible like that. The police and the DA's office became convinced, although nobody had talked about either crime, that they had cracked both of those cases in this one fell swoop. Numerous witnesses came to the station and identified them, Sacco and Vanzetti, in a very improper way, in the most suggestive setting possible, because they were in jail cells. No procedures like a lineup or anything like that, nothing along those lines. Sacco was apparently even made to pose as though he were holding a pistol. Today, all of that's suppressed. It's over. Talk's over. Sacco and Vanzetti would stand trial in Dedham for the Braintree murders. But before that trial, as a tactical matter, D.A. Katzman elected to try Vanzetti in Plymouth for that botched truck robbery. That's the old Plymouth courthouse and the courtroom in which I have sat. It was right up here. I don't know what it is now, some kind of offices. I think it's a municipal building. So he was charged with assault with intent to rob, assault with intent to murder. The theory was that he was the guy who had fired the shotgun toward the truck. But the trial began in June 1920 in this old Plymouth courthouse, and the judge was 64-year-old Webster Thayer of Worcester, and you will see what a fun guy he looks like. This guy did not like foreigners, he did not like radicals, and he sure did not like anarchists. Vanzetti's trial, the evidence against him was weak at best. The identification evidence was almost laughable. Vanzetti's defense was alibi. He wasn't there. There is and was an important Italian tradition on Christmas Eve, Feast of the Seven Fishes, eating eels, all that kind of thing. And 14 witnesses from North Plymouth testified that Vanzetti had delivered to them in person from his pushcart eels at the time of the Bridgewater crime. They were not believed. they were Italian. A friend of mine who was in the newspaper business interviewed one of these witnesses in the 1970s and over the phone, and she cried. 1970s. She cried and said they did not believe us. Vanzetti was convicted. In August of 1920, Thayer sentenced him 12 to 15 years in state prison. That was considered then a very heavy sentence for someone with no criminal record. Less than a month later, in September of 1920, Sacco and Vanzetti were indicted for the Braintree shootings. 5 days after that, September 16, 1920, a man parked a horse-drawn wagon on Wall Street in New York City, the heart of American capitalism, and walked away. The wagon that he had parked was filled with dynamite and heavy cast iron slugs. And when that wagon exploded at noon, 39 people were killed and nearly 300 were seriously injured. Blood literally ran in the street. The most severely damaged is the J.P. Morgan and Company, which was the most powerful private bank in the world. That's the wagon was parked right there. The bomber, the perpetrators of this crime have never been caught or identified, but one controversial theory has it that by November, the guy who did this bombing was back in Italy. Remember Buddha? Maybe. So, Vanzetti's been convicted in Plymouth. He would start trial with Sacco as a convicted defendant. Convicted felon, as a matter of fact. Probably heard that phrase, convicted felon, later. The trial started on May 31st, 1921 in the Norfolk Superior Court in Dedham. Stately building, built in 1827. I've also been here, appeared here, not as a judge but as a lawyer. The only thing I remember is the Dedham House of Pizza, which was about 2 blocks away. And nice, it was good, it was really good. Guess who was presiding? Webster Thayer. He had requested the case. I'd like to be assigned to that case, those two guys, Sacco and Vanzetti. Quickly became obvious he hated their lawyer, who was admittedly a radical lawyer from California, a gentleman named Fred Moore. The trial lasted about 6 weeks through a punishing heat wave. More than 150 witnesses testified. Criminal defendants typically sit at a counsel table with their lawyers so they can communicate with them. They can whisper to them, they can pass notes, whatever they want to do. But in capital cases then, that is cases in which a defendant was facing the death penalty, the defendants sat in a metal enclosure, which was kind of a symbolic cage. This was right in the middle of the courtroom in front of the bench. So you can kind of see it there. There's Vanzetti, that's Sacco, that's Sacco's wife. And things like this comes up the back. The front of it's open, but it has a top on it. It's as close to a cage as you can get without actually being at the zoo or jail. So this practice was banned in 1963. This is pretty suggestive symbolism. Presumption of innocence, not so much. The first jury pool consisted of 500 white guys, no women. Does anybody know when the first women jurors sat in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts? 1951, as a result of a statute passed the previous year. This jury pool was exhausted by day 3. So Judge Thayer ordered the sheriff to go out and find 200 more guys overnight. Among the men grabbed was a newlywed at his wedding dinner. This method of jury selection is clearly unfair. I never saw it actually in play, but there were in the Edgartown courthouse 2 long white poles that had this sort of Commonwealth of Massachusetts symbol on them, and they were used for two purposes. One of them was to cross the doors where the jury was deliberating, which was still being done. But the other one was to go out in the street and tap people for jury service. Supposedly it happened within our very lifetimes. But it's unfair, because the sheriffs can go out and pick whoever they want. They can skip over people if they don't like their looks and pick other people whom they might know or might not know. They did find 175 men, and soon there was a jury for the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. The foreman was a 69-year-old guy named Walter Ripley, who was the former police chief of Quincy. A lot of folklore about picking juries. But one person, if you're a criminal defense lawyer, you don't want on the jury is the former police chief of Quincy or any other police officers. You don't want them. And even worse, in this case, before the trial, a friend of his had mentioned that he thought, based on what he had read, that Sacco and Vanzetti were not guilty of this crime. And Ripley's reported response to that observation was, damn them, they ought to hang them anyway. That's your jury foreman. Now, there's a lot of writing about whether or not Sacco and or Vanzetti were innocent. That's a moral call, not a legal one. You sometimes still see this in newspapers where people talk about people being found innocent in a criminal trial. No, nobody's ever found innocent in a criminal trial. You're either guilty, the Commonwealth, the state, the government has proved your guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, or they have not proved your guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, in which case you're not guilty. So you're guilty or you're not guilty. You're not innocent. Just a little point. Now for this trial, eyewitness testimony ate most of the trial time, which is interesting because numerous studies in the last few decades have suggested that eyewitness testimony is just about the worst kind of evidence you can have. It's very unreliable. Sometimes it is drastically unreliable. There was conflicting evidence even still regarding identifying Sacco. More than 20 witnesses testified that they had seen some of the bandits, and that none of them was Sacco or Vanzetti. One of those witnesses, by the way, was a gentleman named Albert Frantello, who had, just before this crime took place, had walked, he was an employee of Slater and Morrill. He had walked down the street right before it happened and saw the two guys lounging there against the pipe fence and looked at them, looked right at them. And he was walking very close, within an arm's length. He said that neither one of them was Sacco or Vanzetti. And he was the last living witness in this trial. He died in the 1980s, and the reason my focus went to him is because his daughter attended one of my talks on this matter. And his daughter had a folder of newspaper clippings about this gentleman and gave me copies of them. He was the last living witness for this. Now, that's about Sacco. As for Vanzetti, you would have thought that identifying him might be fairly simple. This guy had a monster walrus mustache. No witness put Vanzetti at the crime scene. My favorite witness, one of the Commonwealth's star witnesses, was a woman named Mary Splain. She put Sacco in the getaway car. She supposedly saw him for 3 seconds, tops, from 80 feet away through a second-floor factory window. At the pretrial hearings that she attended, she could not identify Sacco. But at trial, she did, and she described him. He was slightly taller than she was. She estimated his weight at 140 to 145 pounds. He was muscular. Quote, she noticed particularly the left hand was a good-sized hand, a hand that denoted strength. He wore a grayish or navy shirt. He had a clean-cut face with a high forehead. He had brushed back hair, which was 2 to 2.5 inches long. And he had, quote, a peculiar white complexion that looked greenish. And then she was shown a Massachusetts State Police mugshot, and she looked at that mugshot and she said that it bore a striking resemblance to the man I saw in South Braintree. She was among a number of witnesses who identified that mugshot. The problem was the mugshot was of a guy who was in prison in Buffalo at the time. Both Sacco and Vanzetti had alibis. Sacco testified that that day he had been at the Italian consulate in Boston. He was seeking a passport for his family to travel back to Italy following the death of his mother. Several witnesses corroborated his Boston movements, including a passport clerk in the consulate who was unavailable because he was in Italy at the trial time, but his deposition said that Sacco was there about 2 o'clock in the afternoon on April 15th. As for Vanzetti, 6 witnesses corroborated his testimony that he was selling fish, as usual, in Plymouth on April 15th. In addition to the eyewitness testimony, which as you can see was all over the place, there was some physical evidence. Most important was ballistic evidence. This is very complicated, and I won't get into it at length. The ballistics evidence in the 1920s was in its infancy. And here, the evidence is just really convoluted. Suffice it to say that the Commonwealth focused on what became known as bullet number 3. That was the bullet that had severed Birardelli's aorta. I'm pointing up here. The testimony as to whether it came from the Colt that was found on Sacco when he was arrested was equivocal at best. The chain of custody that you need for physical evidence was really not very solid at all. In fact, it was non-existent. And since the trial, there has been a lot of studies regarding these weapons and the ballistics, and the suggestion has been made by more than one writer that the bullets were switched at trial. Also, the Commonwealth's proof was that none of the other 5 bullets came from Sacco's gun, but there was only one shooter. Reasonable doubt? As to Vanzetti, the Commonwealth had no evidence, as I mentioned before, that he was even at the crime scene. So the theory against him was that the .38 caliber pistol that he had on him at the time of arrest was a revolver that the security guard Birardelli might have had. And my reaction to that is, so what? If that's true and that had been proven, you've got receiving stolen property. Don't have murder. But even here, there was no evidence that Birardelli actually had a pistol on him that day. No witness had seen anything removed from Birardelli except for the cash box, large money box. There was some evidence from a gun store owner suggesting the same gun, but years later, that witness described the pressure that was brought to bear on him by the Commonwealth. And he gave the opinion at that time that the gun Vanzetti had was likely not Birardelli's. Then, in 1977, some police files were released, and Chief Stewart, remember him? He's all about fairness. He noted that the police that Birardelli might have had was a .32 caliber pistol. Vanzetti's gun was a .38 caliber pistol. Oh, they also had different serial numbers. Thus, the Commonwealth might have known that the 2 pistols were different. They did not disclose that information to the defense. Another piece of physical evidence was found at the scene. It was a cloth cap that the Commonwealth tried to assert was a cap belonging to Sacco. The cap was found 2 days after the crime. There had been hundreds, if not thousands, of people in that street on Pearl Street after this crime. And if you look at photos from the early decades of the 20th century of men outside, ball game, parade, whatever, everybody has a cap or a hat. Everybody. Apparently it was a federal statute at the time. You had to wear a hat or a cap when you're outside. All the time. And much was made about a hole that was in the back of the cap. Supposedly the theory was that Sacco routinely, when he went to work, took his cap off, hung it on a nail that could have made that tear in the back of the hat. After trial, sometime after trial, a police officer finally owned up to the fact that he had made the hole in the hat looking for a name tag. That's a picture of Sacco. There's the sweating district attorney. And he tried on the garment in open court and appeared to be too small. You might remember a more recent case.
Clothes didn't fit.
Yeah. So apparently here, Fred Moore did not say, if the cap's too tight, guilty ain't right. Oh, one other piece of evidence that you might have expected to encounter at the trial. Remember the stolen car I talked about, the Buick was found in the woods. Supposedly, under Stewart's theory, that was used in both crimes. That vehicle was dusted for fingerprints. But then there was a meeting between the Massachusetts State Police and the DA's office. What happened to those fingerprints? Nobody knows. And there have been a lot of researchers trying to find that. Never developed. Now, the evidence that Judge Thayer emphasized in post-trial motions was consciousness of guilt. And that became key to the conviction of Sacco and Vanzetti. Consciousness of guilt is, in their case, supposedly threatening behavior on the streetcar, being armed, and also lying to the police and the DA back at the police station in Brockton. Simply, if you act guilty through some kind of evasion of that kind, maybe you are guilty, and that might be some evidence. So, the case went to the jury on July 14th. A few days before that, Judge Thayer was at the Worcester Golf Club. And it has been reported that Thayer, at that venue, referred to Sacco and Vanzetti as, quote, those bastards. He said they were Bolsheviki, and he, quote, would get those guys hanged. Thayer shocked a friend of his at a Dartmouth football game. Did you see what I did with those anarchistic bastards the other day? I guess that'll hold them for a while. Let them go to the Supreme Court and see what they can get out of them. No such prejudice of that kind appears in the trial record. Sacco and Vanzetti were convicted. 2 counts, first-degree murder. Sacco, when the verdict came back, seemed stunned, and then he cried out, "They killed 2 innocent men." Rosina screamed. She ran to the cage, as you saw earlier. That wasn't that occasion, but that was during the trial. She ran, screamed, ran over to the cage, and was hysterical, and then police dragged her away. There followed 7 years of motions for new trial on various grounds. All of them were denied by Thayer. There were appeals to the Supreme Judicial Court, the highest court of the Commonwealth. During the appeal process, Fred Moore was replaced by a lawyer named William Thompson, who was a very highly respected, very conservative Boston lawyer who did come to believe that Sacco and Vanzetti were both not guilty. Indeed, he thought they were innocent. In 1925, a 23-year-old inmate at the Dedham jail named Celestino Medeiros, who was an Azorean immigrant awaiting a decision on his appeal of murdering a bank teller in Wrentham during a robbery, confessed that he had taken part in the Braintree robbery at Slater and Morrill. He said Sacco wasn't there, Vanzetti wasn't there. Medeiros later said that he knew that Sacco and Vanzetti were completely innocent of his crime, and he did it because he felt sorry for the kids visiting their father, Sacco. Medeiros told Thompson he was with 4 Italian professional gangsters who had robbed freight cars in Providence. This is exactly the scenario that police in New Bedford and Providence had assumed from the beginning. But Thompson could not use Medeiros' confession until Medeiros' case ended. In 1926, the Supreme Judicial Court considered only questions of law. In a 90-page decision, they found that there was no error at the trial. Massachusetts Rule of Criminal Procedure 30B now allows for a new trial at any time if it appears justice may not have been done. Very much been widely open. Catch-all possibility, and that came too late to provide any assistance to Sacco and Vanzetti. Also in 1926, the Supreme Judicial Court reversed Medeiros' murder conviction, but he was retried, he was convicted again. Thompson sought another new trial based mostly on Medeiros' confession and a startling argument that the district attorney had made a deal with the Department of Justice to learn about anarchists and get rid of Sacco and Vanzetti. In fact, two former Department of Justice agents swore that the general opinion at the Department of Justice was that the Braintree crime had been committed, quote, by a gang of professional highwaymen. Sacco and Vanzetti, though anarchists, had nothing to do with it. Two agents said the Department of Justice had much documentation on this issue. Thompson tried to obtain it, never did, and neither has anyone else. Thayer denied the motion based on the Medeiros confession. He said, in essence, Medeiros is a career criminal, he's not credible, and also his confession might have been bought. No evidence of it. Now the media backlash and public outrage exploded. Even the Boston Herald, you all know the Boston Herald, reversed itself and called for a new trial for Sacco and Vanzetti, editorially. Thompson returned to the SJC with yet another appeal, and by then a number of public intellectuals, artists, and writers joined the worldwide protests, and they were indeed worldwide. Europe, even Asia, South America. Harvard law professor and future Supreme Court of the United States Justice Felix Frankfurter was among them, wrote a book about the whole thing. Edna St. Vincent Millay, who is one of the most well-known poets in the country. Albert Einstein, H.G. Wells, Mary Heaton Vorse, who was a socialist writer who lived on Commercial Street in Provincetown, and the novelist John Dos Passos, also a novelist who lived on Commercial Street in Provincetown. He wrote a pamphlet for the Sacco and Vanzetti Defense Committee that was published in Boston in 1927. I have it here. It is entitled Facing the Chair, Story of the Americanization of Two Foreign-Born Workers. That's the title. If anybody brought their linen gloves, I'll let you look at this. Days after the Supreme Judicial Court denied the last motion for a new trial, in April of that year, Thayer formally sentenced Sacco and Vanzetti to die by electrocution. Judges pronouncing the death sentence to defendants customarily said, "And may the Lord have mercy on your soul." Thayer didn't say it. Sacco cried out, "You condemn two innocent men." Vanzetti had been in Charlestown State Prison. Sacco now joined him in that antiquated and filthy facility. And this guy had been there since 1920. Not him.
No, sorry.
Not them.
Got it.
Him. Ponzi. He's got nothing to do with this. I just love that picture. Before the sentence, back at the sentencing hearing, both men had addressed the court, but Sacco by this time had grown hopeless. Asked if he had anything to say, Vanzetti, who had been studying English in prison, delivered a lengthy statement, the essence of which was that he was not merely not guilty, but innocent, and if the judge were to doom them, it was solely because Vanzetti had fought what he called the oppression of the man by the man. Public support for Sacco and Vanzetti was not universal, although it was growing, fueled by such passion as displayed by Vanzetti. Many petitions were aimed at Governor Alvin Fuller, who had beat Curley in 1924 to become governor, whose clemency was now earnestly sought. Fuller, who looks pretty happy with himself there, was a self-made millionaire. He was the owner of one of the first auto dealerships in Massachusetts, and in 1920 he was deemed to own the most successful auto dealership in the world. Fuller, in a highly unusual move, appointed a committee to advise him as to the fairness or unfairness of the trial. And there was a committee of 3. Here's where the Cotuit stuff comes in. Harvard President Abbott Lawrence Lowell, MIT President Samuel Stratton, and retired probate judge Robert Grant. Lowell was president of Harvard from 1909 to 1932, and for almost that entire tenure, he, as many of you probably know in greater detail than I, was a summer resident here in Cotuit, right down Main Street, 880 Main Street. And in 1943, he donated 135 acres of land that became Lowell Holly Reservation. So far, so good. But he was also, in the words of one source, a dangerous bigot, a man of virulent prejudices who systematically used his position of power to exclude and oppress those whom he hated. And that was a lot of people. To another writer, Lowell's, quote, worldview amounted to undisguised white Christian supremacy, and he did not hesitate to put these diseased beliefs into action. Lowell's discriminations at Harvard, black, Asian, Jewish, gay, well documented. The depth of his prejudice against foreign atheistic anarchists can only be imagined. Dozens of witnesses testified before or spoke with the committee. I don't know why I'm looking up here, it's really got nothing to do with what I'm saying. They even spoke with Vanzetti.
I'm trying.
That's a Ben Shawn artwork from the 30s. Here's your buddy Lowell right there in the center. There's Thayer, it's portrait in the back, Stratton and Grant. I don't know if these are the most qualified people to judge the fairness of the trial, but that's what we picked. Anyway, they did speak to witnesses. They had witnesses testify. Sacco would not talk with them. Vanzetti did talk to them at length. And except for the probate judge, Vanzetti thought they might be impartial. He did not believe that Governor Fuller, quote, is going to burn us. After reviewing the committee's decision, the governor announced his decision on August 3rd. He believed Sacco and Vanzetti were guilty. He believed they had a fair trial, and there was no reason to give them a new trial. This decision really sparked some demonstrations involving many thousands of people around the world. August 10th was set as the date of their execution. That date was then stayed until August 22nd. That day, Governor Fuller received numerous visitors, along with 1,000 letters and telegrams, almost all of them, or at least most of them, urging clemency for these two defendants. It's August 22nd. At 5 o'clock that evening, light dinner was served to Sacco and Vanzetti and to Medeiros. Oh, we're not there yet. There. Hundreds of police officers surrounded Charlestown Prison. There was a large public throng there. Reportedly among the crowd was Joe Morelli, who was probably, in my view, the guy who led this crime. At 8:45 p.m. came word that the last petition for writ of habeas corpus was denied. The warden went in and told Medeiros. He went in and told Sacco and Vanzetti. Now I'm going to show the electric chair. It's in a white, well-lit death chamber. There were doctors there, corrections officials, one reporter selected by lot. Behind the screen, there were 3 green slabs. Now, when more than one condemned prisoner was to be executed in a single session, the one least able to stand up under the ordeal of awaiting his or her turn went first. At 12:03 on August 23rd, 23-year-old Medeiros stumbled into the death chamber, and he appeared to be in some kind of stupor. He didn't say anything. 1,400 to 1,900 volts were administered 3 times. 36-year-old Sacco was next. He called out to Vanzetti, "Goodbye." He sat calmly in the chair until the guards started to adjust the straps around his body and apply the electrodes to him. And he suddenly bolted upright and cried out, "Viva l'anarchia!" Long live anarchy. Everything was ready then, except for them placing the mask over his face. They couldn't find it. So a frantic search ensued, and they were looking all over the place for the mask, and then Sacco cried out in broken English, "Farewell, my wife and child and all my friends." By then, Sacco actually had 2 children, his son Dante, and he had a daughter named Agnes. She was born soon after he was incarcerated. And then to the witnesses, Sacco said politely, "Good evening, gentlemen." The mask had been caught in Medeiros' clothing. So they retrieved that from his dead body, returned into the death chamber and put the mask on Sacco. And then he addressed his deceased mother, "Farewell, mia madre." And then an extra heavy current of 1,800 to 2,000 volts. Why the heavy current? Sacco had been on a hunger strike. His body lacked salts and water, which conduct electricity. And then Vanzetti, who was now 39 years old, shook hands with the guards and thanked them. He thanked the warden. He walked the 20 steps to the death chamber, and as he was being strapped into the chair, he calmly addressed the witnesses, and he said, "I wish to tell you I am innocent and never committed any crime, but sometimes some sin. I thank you for everything you have done for me. I am innocent of all crime, not only of this, but all. I am an innocent man." Then he said, "I wish to forgive some people for what they are now doing to me." And then 1,400 to 1,800 volts. Sacco and Vanzetti. Sacco, hard-working family man. He loved his vegetable garden. Vanzetti was a self-taught intellectual who was very much beloved in his humble community of North Plymouth. Nice guys, but they were committed anarchists who were not adverse, at least to the notion that bombing to advance their cause was justified, though no evidence has ever linked either of them to any such terrorist acts. Were they innocent of shooting Parmenter and Biodelli? Probably. Were they proven guilty of those murders beyond a reasonable doubt? No. By the way, none of the stolen money was ever found. Certainly no money was ever linked to either one of them, or indeed to any anarchists. And stealing payroll money belonging to shoe factory workers, keeping in mind that Sacco was a shoe factory worker who championed workers in their way, even attended the strike in Lawrence, seems somewhat illogical. They have never been pardoned. To do so would involve accepting that they were guilty. But in 1977, on the 50th anniversary of their executions, Governor Michael Dukakis issued a proclamation that any disgrace should be forever removed from their names. And 20 years later, in 1997, the Commonwealth finally accepted a couple of casts of the memorial plaque that had been designed by sculptor Gutzon Borglum, who did Mount Rushmore. He had created this 60 years earlier. Sacco and Vanzetti lay in open caskets at Joseph Langoni's on Hanover Street for 3 days in a candlelit room. 100,000 people viewed their bodies. This is their funeral, rainy day. It's estimated that 200,000 people attended their funeral. The hearses drove side by side 8 miles to the cemetery, and there they were cremated. Those are their death masks. Vanzetti, Sacco. And then they really worked together. Their ashes were commingled. Some of them probably went to Rosina, Sacco's wife. Some of them probably went to the Sacco and Vanzetti Defense Committee, and then to the Boston Public Library, where they won't let you see it because I asked, but they have it. And then Vanzetti's sister Luigia, who had come over for the trial, took 2 urns back to Italy with these commingled ashes, and she took one each to 2 villages 540 miles apart. And that's the end.
We have time for a couple questions. If anyone has a question.
Not totally related to this, but that
That's
Judge,
okay.
that Judge Thayer, is he any relation to some of the other Thayers from the Worcester area, like the guy who wrote Casey the Bad, and the editor
Oh, yeah.
and the editor of the Dial in the 20s?
Probably. A very well-known family. He's, by the way, somebody tried to bomb his house in Worcester one time.
And my other question is, when you mentioned the polls in the Edgartown courthouse,
Oh, yeah.
where they would tap somebody,
Yeah.
is that the origin of the word catch pole?
How the hell would you expect me to know that? Yeah, that's a good question. Anybody else have any questions? No, I don't know. I don't know. But that's worth looking into. Worth looking into. I'm wondering too, catch pole might also, in churches way back when, they had a pole. They usually attached a pig's bladder or something to the end of it, and if you fell asleep, they would whack you with it. So,
Well, I know that it was the title of an official, and it has.
oh, the catch pole?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's entered into the English language as a last name. I once knew a guy named Tom Catchpole that was so unusual. I looked it up, but I forget. I just know that it was used. There was an official name, like Bailiff or something.
You know what? I think I looked that up too, and I also forgot it because I talked at the courthouse one time about that, and I wanted to point out those polls. And I think I did look it up, but I don't remember now.
Thank you.
Worth a look. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Yeah, do you have one book about this Sacco and Vanzetti case that you think is better than the others?
There's a lot of books about them. I think the one is one that I read most recently. It's called The Execution of Sacco and Vanzetti. That's pretty good. And it's the first book. I thought this was an original notion with me, but after I came up with it, I found it in this book. Can't remember the name of the person who wrote it, I'm sorry. The Execution of Sacco and Vanzetti. That book talks about the law that now would have ended this thing on a street code. And I haven't seen any other references to it. There may be some, I just haven't seen them. But it occurred to me when I was reading about this whole thing years ago on the streetcar, I thought, that is not an arrest. I'm sorry, it's not legitimate. And the guy who wrote that book points that out pretty well. That's the one I would say. There are a lot of them. A lot of books. The Black Flag's not a bad one. There's another one by a guy named Paul Average, who's an expert on anarchy and anarchism. And he's got one where he talks about the anarchistic background of Sacco and Vanzetti and Galliani. So,
I want to thank you, Greg.
Thank
This
you.
was great to talk and really
Thanks.
enjoyed it. For all of you, that, especially the people that are new to us, please sign in and leave us your email so that we can be in touch and tell you about it.
I'll be in touch too.
Yeah, and as I said, this is the last one for this season, so I hope we'll see you next June when we start our 2025 season of Chronicles, and thank you very much.
Thank you.